It was a cold spring night in 1974 in the quiet Connecticut town of East Hartford. The streets were empty. A faint chill clung to the air, and porch lights glowed against the stillness. The town was settling into its nightly rhythm, families finishing dinner, televisions buzzing with the evening news, neighbors locking their doors. But for 19-year-old Janet Couture, this ordinary evening would spiral into something unimaginable. A brutal act of violence that shocked her hometown, tore through her family's world, and left investigators searching for answers that, even now, nearly half a century later, remain elusive. The case of Janet Couture is more than a local tragedy. It is a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how one night, one decision, one unseen danger can change everything. It is the story of a promising young woman whose life was stolen, and whose memory lingers like a question that no one has been able to answer. Janet was 19 years old in 1974, an age where possibilities stretched out wide. She grew up in East Hartford, a suburban community along the Connecticut River. The town was home to working-class and middle-class families, a place where many parents worked at Pratt and Whitney or nearby offices, while kids spent summers at ballparks or local diners. It wasn't the kind of place where violent crime seemed likely to intrude. Janet's life reflected the heart of this community. She was known as kind, approachable, and full of youthful optimism. Friends said she had an easy laugh, the kind of person who could lift the mood of a room without even trying. She was responsible, but she also enjoyed the freedom of her age, meeting up with friends, talking about music, and dreaming about the future. She loved pop culture of the time, from Carole King to Simon and Garfunkel, and often talked about wanting to travel outside her small town someday. Her family adored her. She wasn't just a daughter or a sister. She was a piece of glue that held everyone together. She often helped with chores at home, looked after younger relatives, and found time to comfort friends when they were struggling. Her warmth was genuine, and people noticed it. No one imagined that her life would be brutally cut short. On an April evening in 1974, Janet set out like she had done countless times before. Some reports suggest she had been visiting friends or running a simple errand. What is certain is that she was last seen walking in East Hartford after dark. Witnesses recalled seeing her on foot, moving toward her neighborhood. She looked relaxed, not in distress, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. But that ordinary walk became the final time anyone would see her alive. Later that night, police were called after a horrifying discovery. Janet's body was found not far from her neighborhood. She had been violently attacked. The brutality of the crime was clear. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a case of wrong place and wrong time. This was murder, and it was personal. Authorities did not release all the details, both to protect the investigation and out of respect for the family. But those who knew the basics were shaken by the sheer savagery. East Hartford was not prepared for this. The idea that a teenage girl, someone from their community, could be killed so mercilessly left people stunned. For parents, it was a nightmare realized. For young women in the town, it was a chilling reminder of vulnerability. Doors were locked earlier, teenagers were warned not to walk alone, and a quiet tension spread over the town. Investigators moved quickly. The scene was combed for evidence, interviews were conducted, and leads were chased down. But this was 1974, and the tools available to detectives were far more limited than today. DNA analysis was still science fiction. Crime scene processing lacked the rigor we expect now. Fibers, fingerprints, and other physical traces could be collected, but often without the precision or preservation methods necessary for later testing. Police talked to family members, friends, and acquaintances. Who might Janet have been with that night? Did she have any conflicts? Anyone who wanted to harm her? Nothing stood out. Janet wasn't involved with drugs or dangerous crowds. She wasn't known for risky behavior. The lack of an obvious suspect made the case incredibly difficult. Rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that Janet must have known her killer, that she might have agreed to meet someone and trusted them, only to be betrayed. Others were convinced it was random, perhaps a stranger who saw her walking alone and acted on a violent impulse. A few pointed out that in the 1970s, Connecticut and nearby states saw several unsolved murders of young women. some of which had eerie similarities. Could Janet's murder have been part of a larger pattern? Police did look at potential suspects. They interviewed men who lived nearby, young men who had known Janet socially, even drifters passing through town. But none of these leads ever produced enough evidence to make an arrest. Every theory seemed to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. As weeks turned into months, the frustration mounted. The local newspapers initially covered Janet's murder heavily, but with no updates, the coverage faded. The story fell to the inside pages, then disappeared altogether. For the community, life eventually went on, but for Janet's family, the silence was unbearable. Their daughter's murder had become a cold case, and they had to live with the reality that justice might never come. What makes cases like Janet's so haunting is not just the lack of answers, but the sense of unfinished life. Janet should have had decades ahead of her. She might have built a career, traveled the world, raised a family of her own. All of that was taken in one violent night. For her loved ones, every holiday, every milestone, every ordinary day carried the shadow of her absence. Decades passed, but the case was never closed. Occasionally, it resurfaced in whispers, in conversations among old neighbors, or in the memories of those who grew up in East Hartford in the 1970s. Some still wondered if the killer was someone local, someone who walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores, nodded politely at neighbors, all while hiding a terrible secret. The possibility of solving Janet's case today is not entirely gone. Could Janet's murder have been part of a larger pattern? Police did look at potential suspects. They interviewed men who lived nearby, young men who had known Janet socially, even drifters passing through town. But none of these leads ever produced enough evidence to make an arrest. Every theory seemed to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. As weeks turned into months, the frustration mounted. The local newspapers initially covered Janet's murder heavily, but with no updates, the coverage faded. The story fell to the inside pages, then disappeared altogether. For the community, life eventually went on, but for Janet's family, the silence was unbearable. Their daughter's murder had become a cold case, and they had to live with the reality that justice might never come. What makes cases like Janet's so haunting is not just the lack of answers, but the sense of unfinished life. Janet should have had decades ahead of her. She might have built a career, traveled the world, raised a family of her own. All of that was taken in one violent night. For her loved ones, every holiday, every milestone, every ordinary day carried the shadow of her absence. Decades passed, but the case was never closed. Occasionally, it resurfaced in whispers, in conversations among old neighbors, or in the memories of those who grew up in East Hartford in the 1970s. Some still wondered if the killer was someone local, someone who walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores, nodded politely at neighbors, all while hiding a terrible secret. The possibility of solving Janet's case today is not entirely gone. Across the country, cold cases from the same era have been cracked wide open thanks to advances in forensic science. Genetic genealogy, in particular, has allowed investigators to take old DNA evidence and trace it through family trees to identify suspects. Murderers who thought they had escaped justice for decades have suddenly been unmasked. Could the same happen for Janet Couture? It depends. The critical question is whether any biological evidence from the crime scene was preserved. In the 1970s, not every piece of evidence was carefully stored, and sometimes it was discarded when a case went cold. But if something, blood, hair, or clothing fibers, remains in a police archive, then modern technology could breathe new life into this investigation. Until then, the mystery remains. The murder of Janet Couture was not just a crime against one person. It was a wound in the fabric of a community. It left East Hartford with a chilling memory, a reminder that violence can strike even the most ordinary of towns. For those who were teenagers in 1974, Janet's death was a formative moment, a loss of innocence, a realization that safety was not guaranteed. The questions linger. Did Janet know her killer? Was it someone she trusted? Perhaps a friend or acquaintance who turned violent? Or was it the work of a stranger, an opportunistic predator who slipped into town, committed a horrific act, and vanished without a trace? And what of the killer? If they are still alive today, they would be decades older. Have they lived an ordinary life, hiding their guilt under the mask of normalcy? Or have they carried the burden of silence, knowing that one night in 1974 changed everything? True crime stories often leave us with fascination, but they also demand reflection. At their heart are not just mysteries, but people. Janet Couture was not just a victim, not just a name in a file. She was a daughter, a friend, a teenager with hopes and plans. Her life mattered, and her story still matters. As we look back nearly 50 years later, her case forces us to confront the fragility of life, the failings of justice, and the persistence of memory. It reminds us that behind every unsolved crime is a family that never stopped grieving, a community that never fully healed, and a name that deserves to be remembered. Perhaps one day, the mystery will break. Perhaps evidence will resurface, or a confession will emerge, or technology will finally reveal the truth. Until that day, the murder of Janet Couture remains unfinished. It is a cold case, yes, but it is also a call to never forget, to keep asking questions, to keep searching for answers. Janet's story still echoes in East Hartford. It still lingers in the minds of those who knew her, those who lived through that time, and those who refused to let her memory fade. Her life was cut short, but her name endures as a haunting reminder of the danger that can hide in the most ordinary of places, and as a plea for justice that has gone unanswered for far too long. Almost half a century later, one truth remains clear. The story of Janet Couture is not over.